This week on Snark Squad Pod, we're joined by Samantha Lane from Thoughts on Tomes to talk about spoilers. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. I am your host, Marines, and with me, as always, is my co-host,
Nicole Sweeney. Hello, and we are joined this week by dear friend of the podcast, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, and I talk books and sometimes other media on my YouTube channel, Thoughts on Tomes, and you can find me in all the social media on Thoughts on Tomes. Pretty convenient.
Sam is here for another very special episode. They're all very special and dear to us, but this is not going to be a media-specific episode, which actually I think the first episode you were on was the adaptations one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Sam is back to do that again. It's been a while since we've done one of these episodes. So we actually put this up as a poll on our Patreon and, had a couple ideas for things we could talk about. And this was the winning topic. So we are talking about spoilers. Normally, this is the part where I would do like a plot synopsis. In lieu of that, I don't know. If you don't know what spoilers are are any information that you learn about a story or like piece of media before consuming that piece of media.
And in media episodes, this is where I would ask if you liked a thing, and that still kind of applies. My first question is pretty much about your general feelings on spoilers. Do you like them?
It's such a weird question because I do feel like people get like really upset. It's like, do you like having the flu? I don't
don't mind it.
Not really, but like also if I get the flu, it might be my fault. I don't know. So that's kind of how I feel about spoilers. I wasn't really spoiled before the internet. I never had friends that spoiled TV shows or movies or books or anything for me. But then when I got into fandom, I got into Tumblr.com, which is a just landmine for spoilers because there's really no system in place for avoiding them. They do have different like plugins and stuff now, but honestly, it's hit and miss. So that's when I first started getting spoiled. But I have found that, one, if I get spoiled, I really don't blame other people for it, especially online, because that person isn't usually coming into my space and spoiling me. I've never had that happen. It's always I'm stumbling upon something. And that's my bad. And also, there's been times that I've seen something about a piece of media, and then been more intrigued by it. So I don't seek out being spoiled. I'm not someone that looks for spoilers, but like there's been times that I've sort of been spoiled and then gotten into a thing because I was spoiled for it.
So I have actively sought out spoilers. We've talked about this a lot on the Song of Ice and Fire episodes of the podcast, that like while watching Game of Thrones, I fell real deep on the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki, just like looking up, like it started out, just innocently enough, certain characters. I was like, I need to know if they're still alive. And then, like you just like acquire information that way. And I don't know, something about that I found a good way for me. I don't know. I wanted that information beforehand for reasons that I can't entirely articulate, except that I felt like it would soften the blow if I knew it was coming in some kind of way. I don't know. Beyond that, I don't like, I'm not actively seeking them out. I super do not care. As a general rule, anytime someone tells me that like being spoiled ruins a story in some way, my gut reaction is that the story is not that good. Like if the story requires surprise to be effective, there's a part of me that's like, I don't know, anything that relies on like a gotcha, that I'm not interested in that as a thing. Yeah, I don't know. Your flu analogy is funny, but like, I don't know. Yeah, you didn't get the flu shot. Like, I don't know. Did you bring this on yourself? I have very little patience for it, and I'm like kind of mean about people who get very touchy about spoilers in a lot of contexts, but especially for like big event TV, like Game of Thrones, again, like super popular stuff that I'm just like, I don't know, man, you're the one who's going on social media. This is like a wildly popular thing. If you chose to hang out on social media without any sort of like plugins or filters, and there are so many of them, there are so many ways that you can like block that stuff out. But if you're choosing to do that, I don't know. That's on, and like you care a lot about not being spoiled. I shrug.
To be clear, we're not victim blaming recipients of the flu. I'm sure you did your best.
If you have no health reasons why you can't get the flu shot, I am totally victim blaming you. On behalf of all the people who can't get the flu shot, that's totally not what this podcast is about. But like, also, get your fucking flu shot.
As I was thinking about spoilers in preparation for this episode, it led me down this entire path where I started to think about how, as a woman in my 30s, I am like legit turning into my mother. And I had this like flashback of watching movies with my mom, and she would be like standing, not even like entirely in the room, but like, you know, at the door, like half watching and going, how does it end? How does it end? And if we didn't tell her like, Mom, they end up together, it's fine. Like, she would be too stressed out to watch and she would leave. And it would annoy us so much as kids. They were like, one, because half the time we didn't know how it ended. Like, I'm watching the same movie you are. What do I know? And two, because we would like laugh at her. Like, what is she doing? She can't watch a movie without like knowing the ending. But like, me, like like as I get older, the more that I love spoilers, and I seek them out pretty consistently for certain types of media, and I find that they help me a lot in terms of, Nicole called it like softening the blow, but as somebody who like deep dives into media with their feelings and also suffers from like anxiety things, I find that spoilers really help me navigate some kinds of stories, and they do help soften the blow, and I'm super like those. It doesn't get ruined to me by knowing certain plot points. You know, it helps me navigate the story sometimes. So I'm pro spoiler. I'm sorry.
It's fun sometimes too to actually try and see how like they get to whatever, you know, this point, this thing that you know.
Right.
Sam, at the beginning, you mentioned not having any experience with spoilers until the internet, and I had completely forgotten about this. But my actual first experience with spoilers was pre-internet. When I was a kid, we used to go to Blockbuster pretty regularly. Like my dad would take us all, and everybody could pick out a movie, and both of my brothers had gone to see The Sixth Sense in the theater. And I was like, what, 11, maybe 10, 11, something like that. And that was a movie I was going to check out. And we were standing in the line, and my little brother, if I'm 10, he's like 6. While we're standing in the line to check out, my parents were very liberal with our, like, letting us watch. My 6-year-old little brother saw this R-rated movie. It's fine. Don't worry about it. It's cool. That's like a separate thread here. But we're standing in the line to check out, and my little brother is like, oh yeah, that was a good one. It was so crazy how he was dead the whole time. And I just stood there in the Blockbuster, horrified and like unsure of what to do. So that's when I learned that, you know, you can never be protected. Spoilers are everywhere.
Someone's gonna at you and be like,
Yes.
I didn't know this.
Listen,
Spoilers.
statute of limitations is so up on that.
I was going to say two things. One is that we probably should have said up at top that this episode full of about spoilers will probably be full of spoilers, so that's a thing. But also on my list of like the things that have been spoiled for me, The Sixth Sense was number one. I don't remember who even spoiled it for me, but I knew before watching that movie that he was dead the whole time. And that's
I was literally standing in line to get this fucking movie.
That's one too that I think that like knowing that really does take something away from the viewing experience.
Yes.
So that one really upset me.
Even though you are pro spoiler, that was
that was an example on the other side. Sam, has there ever been a spoiler that ruined something for you?
Oh gosh, ruined. Not so much ruined. See, the spoiler that sticks out in my head was again from Tumblr.com, and it was for things that I didn't really care about. I'm referring to Tumblr.com like really officially. I've noticed I've been doing that. Yeah, it was for I was double spoiled for Divergent and The Fault in Our Stars through a post on Tumblr because they were talking about how the same actress is in those movies, and so they said how August was seeing Tris in heaven, and he was confused because like it wasn't Hazel Grace, and like it was this whole thing, and I was like, wait, okay, so August dies in that book and she died in that book. Okay, cool. But it was things I didn't really care about, but it sticks out in my brain because it was a double spoiler. And how did that happen? Like what? So yeah, that's the one. But again, it didn't ruin my life or anything. I was just like, all right, it's fine.
The Tris spoilers end like long, like a slow, I don't know, to get to that point too. So if you're like in the middle of them, like, well, cool, great, thanks.
Yeah, I was on book 1 and I was just looking up Divergent. Like I didn't know at that time. I didn't know there was a whole like the trilogy was like basically done or whatever. Well, it had to have been done obviously because that's when she dies.
Right.
So yeah, I was just innocently looking through Tumblr when I first discovered it, and that's how I discovered that the tags are not safe and you need to be very careful.
Yes.
I said about being pro-spoiler, and I'm sticking to that sentiment, but I will say that in my quest to spoil myself, it does kind of sometimes ruin things for me a little bit. Specifically, after reading a first book in a series, I will spoil myself on the entire rest of the series.
Oh my
God. I will read book summaries just to get an idea of where the series goes. And like, I'm already not great at finishing series, and it just gives me more ammunition to not finish. I'm like, those two? And then they go here? Like, nah, no thanks. Not gonna invest time. So I ruin things for myself quite a lot, but I just don't care about it.
But that's like a choice that you're making. You're choosing to ruin the things for yourself, which is a little bit different than people who get upset about having that done to them, which is kind of like, I don't know. I get where that's coming from, especially if it's a thing where like people enter into conversations. If you're talking about something that you're excited about and then people on the internet respond like with spoilers or information or like on Twitter or whatever, wherever you might be talking about some sort of movie or something that you're excited to see that somebody else has already seen or whatever, like that's malicious and mean. And like, that's when I say that I don't care about spoilers and like I'm not particularly sensitive to people who do care about them. This is like a separate, I mean that in sort of like people who come across them organically, like Sam's example of like finding something on just scrolling through Tumblr. That wasn't somebody being like, hey Sam, look at this information about like it's not like targeted, like, which like as a separate thing, I think that if someone was like, oh, you're reading Divergent, Tris dies in the last book.
Oh yeah, that'd be super dick move. Yeah.
Like that's mean.
Yeah.
and terrible.
Yeah. I also think there's a line too of just like kind of being respectful. Like, for example, I have not seen Avengers Infinity War yet, and I have like completely like I've been off Tumblr for months now because I don't want to be spoiled. I have everything blocked on Twitter still, but the day after it opened in theaters, I went into a comic book store, and like this was like the morning after it opened on like the Thursday night, right? Like it's not even like it had not even been a full day.
So it's like official opening day.
It's official,
then,
yeah,
the Friday.
Exactly. And a bunch of dudes were talking about like things that happened, and I had to plug my ears, and I was like, guys, it's not even the weekend yet. Like people haven't had time, and like I get I'm in a place where like that could happen, but also I was like, shouldn't you respect your own loves and like let people like enjoy it first? So I had to like yell at them, and they were like, you know, it's already released, and it's sort of like saying that Dumbledore dies, and I was like, that thing is 15 years old. That is not the same. So I had to like shout at them, and thankfully I still haven't been spoiled, even though the internet is trying real hard to spoil me on Marvel stuff. But like I'm protecting myself as much as possible. But that's kind of one of those things where like, yeah, there's a line too between like someone maliciously doing it and also like, please don't talk about Game of Thrones like an hour after it airs in public. Like let people get back to their like DVR, you know, stuff like that.
Yes. I don't know. So Game of like, yes, in public, I think that that's fair. Like, I think that there's, you know, maybe, I don't know, it depends on where you are.
I'm talking like physical public, not like social media. Like if social media, that's your own thing. You got to be careful yourself. But if you're at the grocery store and you're like, I haven't had my chance to get home, like to check this out, then it's like, dude, like don't talk about it yet. It just aired an hour ago. That's not fair.
Right. That's fair. I think with movies especially, you got to at least give it like opening weekend.
Right.
That like opening weekend seems like a fair minimum requirement. Maybe even more. I'm not going to say what it is, but I will say that I had a similar to what you were describing Tumblr experience with Infinity Wharf. Like a totally just like I was like scrolling through and I was like, oh, these are fun gifts, and then it was like something like the end of the post was like radical spoiler that I was like, wow, that is information that I've just learned about this movie that I was not at all expecting to seek or whatever. So if you go on Tumblr a lot, you definitely need to get XKit or something like that.
The best part of this story is Nicole told me this story like, oh, oops, I just came across like something, and I was like, ooh, what? And I went to go and I like had to recreate her search to try and like find what she had been spoiled on, and I definitely found like the exact post, and like at the end I was like, oh, like it was a very strange experience because I wasn't necessarily seeking out those spoilers. I didn't want to know them at that time, but I couldn't help myself because I knew Nicole got spoiled on something, and
you have like a knowledge-based FOMO. Like you're not like you're missing out on experiences. Your big fear is missing out on knowledge that other people have.
Oh my God, you just diagnosed my entire love of spoilers.
Something that we were asked on Twitter when we mentioned that we were recording this episode was about the way that sometimes representation can wind up being a spoiler or being perceived as a spoiler. And I'm curious, like, what all of your experiences have been with that. Specifically, the comment was about like queer identities, which I think is probably the most common way you see this, but there are definitely examples of it in other kinds of stories. But like I don't know. So one of my favorite books that I read this year was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which, spoiler, there's like a major, like the main character is bisexual. And like writing a Goodreads review for this was like a weird thing. Cause I was like, am I allowed to say that I appreciated, like as a bisexual woman, I appreciated this representation. I don't know. Like I felt really weird about it, but also I want to be like, hey, like this is really cool and good, and I appreciate this. But also, like I don't know, it felt like a spoiler. I don't know. I wasn't sure if I had to use like the spoiler tags on Goodreads when talking about it. I think I err on the side of I would rather tell people that that's there than and like. Sorry, spoiler averse people. It's to me, it's more important to acknowledge that the rep exists. But it's like a weird thing in sort of spoiler discourse on the internet.
Oh, definitely. It's like a huge point of contention. But I will say that I have not read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but I've been hearing everyone loving it, and I didn't know that there was bi rep in it, and now I'm like, oh, let's read that immediately. Also, as a bi woman. So like literally, I just got technically spoiled for something, even though I don't consider identity a spoiler at all myself. But technically, I just got spoiled. Now I'm like even more real hyped to read it. So I think it's definitely a good thing, like you were saying, that it's more important for people with those identities to know that they're being represented and being represented well than for it to be spoiled, which again, it shouldn't. I could go on a whole like diatribe about this. Like, I think this stems from the fact that for a long time before we really had a lot of these conversations about diversity in media, diversity was used as this like plot twist. Like, ooh, look, like we're being like really progressive and like, ooh, like see this. And it's just like, that's not what anyone really was asking for. They were not asking for their identities to be plot twists and like sensationalized. So I think people are still a little bit behind in the times with that, where they're like, I didn't want to know this going in. And typically when I hear someone say it's a spoiler, they didn't want to know this going in. It's like, well, you're not of that identity then, because if you were, you'd want to know because you'd want to then read that thing. So I'm just kind of like, that because of that, your opinion's irrelevant. So like, sorry about it.
I think it definitely is a privilege thing where you can say like, oh, I'd rather not know, because you have so much media to choose from probably that represents you that it doesn't matter to you where you turn, because you will probably see yourself reflected. And so something like that can exist as a plot twist without really affecting you in any way, shape, or form. For the people to who that representation really matters, they need to know going out up front. They need to know that exists. So I am firmly in camp. Identity is not a spoiler. This was a huge topic in BookTube around the time that Ready Player One was very popular, because there is a character there that is surprise lesbian, I believe, and then also surprise a woman. Like it's like a whole mess in that book, but you can't really talk about it because it takes something away from the story. So people were getting very mad at people who were discussing the existence of that representation. So there's a whole discourse on it. And I'm firmly in that camp that if you are using identity and representation in that way, that's an entire other discussion, but people need to know, and the people who are represented by that probably want that information up front.
I also think, to your point about like if you are using it in that way, that's a whole other discussion. I think that is, I don't know, that comes back to so many of my larger feelings on spoilers and my sort of general ambivalence about the idea of being spoiled, because again, there's this element of gotcha in the storytelling that is just in particular, if you're trying to do quote unquote representation as any sort of gotcha, like that's just bad representation. I don't know. Like I think if knowing the identities of the characters who you are supposedly representing in your story is a spoiler that ruins the ability of someone to enjoy your story, then probably one, I'm dubious of your storytelling, but also I'm like particularly side-eyeing your ability to do representation well.
Oh, definitely. And there was also this whole argument for a while when this was first a thing that people were like, oh, well, you don't want to spoil it because then maybe somebody who's like really racist or homophobic might pick up this book and really like this character. And then when they find out they're gay or black, like it'll change their whole, their mindset.
No.
It's like, yeah, like that is so not true. So
You're
like that
argument.
Yeah. It's like suddenly we're having like this whole change. Like that's not what happens. Like, thank you for that wishful thinking. Go back to Disney World. Like, it's not happening.
That's also just like such a terrible way to treat the idea of representation and who it is existing for. Like the idea that anybody who would have the opportunity to see themselves represented shouldn't talk about or acknowledge that in case some like shitty privileged person like in deference to somebody, I don't know, like that just seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
Just like the whole premise is bullshit.
Yeah, it's real icky. It's real icky.
There was another, this kind of came up again, I think it's around Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alida Sands. It's about Aristotle and Dante, and not spoiler, they fall in love. And so people were like kind of, upset that people were talking about these two boys falling in love in that book. And so some of these things you kind of have to flip on their head and think about if you've ever heard anybody going, oh, Bella and Edward get together, you spoiled that for me.
Right.
No, you don't say that. And it's okay to talk about Bella and Edward, and nobody cares. So you should, that same treatment of Aristotle and Dante, like that exists too. So flip it on its head and you tell me if you feel the same way. If you don't, then there's some larger issues there that have nothing to do with spoilers.
Yes.
So I've been talking a little bit about my experience on BookTube so far, and I think we had a little bit of this when we started the podcast as well, where we weren't sure in the first few episodes if you go back, like if we were doing spoilers or not, and somebody actually commented like, hey, just talk about spoilers because without them, like the episodes can get kind of fuzzy or whatnot. So I guess as people who talk about media online, we also have to come up against this as like content creators and what other people think about spoilers. On BookTube, it's wild. People get really defensive about spoilers, and you can barely give a book summary, or else somebody's like, "Oh, you ruined that for me." So, how do you guys feel about that from that side of about like content creators? Have you ever ruined something for somebody or anything along those lines?
I've ruined so many things for people, apparently, according to my comments, and I'm just like, I'm not here for it. I get super salty when someone's like, oh my god, you spoiled me, because usually it happens the most on my videos talking about ships or couples, and I'm like, listen, you walked in here, and you should have expected this, because I'm literally talking about people that obviously get together. So if you don't want to know that information, don't come in this house. Like, it's clearly labeled. So I get like real mad. And I'm like, it's a couples video. If you're worried about it, like, don't come here. So yeah, but I've definitely also had things where it's like, oh, this is not a spoiler-free review because in the synopsis you said this, and I'm like, well, that's literally on the back of the cover. Like, I don't know what to tell you. So I've kind of I'm so like, I don't care about your feelings when it comes to spoilers, because I do try, like, I don't blatantly spoil like the end of a book or anything like that, but in certain videos, I will talk about people who get together or whatever, and some people consider that a major spoiler, even though it's not really a plot point, it's a subplot.
Yeah, BookTube is like a whole other category. I don't know. It's for SnarkSquad stuff, our whole jam is talking about stuff in such detail that it's like it's a given. I don't know. It obviously, as you mentioned, when we started the podcast, we were kind of finding our legs and figuring out what to do and what our approach was going to be. But ultimately, we landed on the side of, yeah, we're just going to assume that the whole thing will be spoiled. We're going to talk about all of it just because that's like what we do. The closest that I guess I have come to being told that I like ruined things isn't even being told that. It's more just I have some friends who watch like Game of Thrones in particular who don't watch it real time, and so like they mute me while the show is airing. They mute me on Twitter, and I'm like, I know that they do this, and I'm like, that's fine. That's I get it. I understand why you're making that choice. I have no hard feelings. Like that's cool, and that is about as close as I have come to that.
So I have a video up online about unreliable narrators and just talking about different kinds of unreliable narrators and recommending some books or talking about some books that I've read that use that kind of device or trope. And I got a comment on, it's literally called Unreliable Narrators, the video. And I get a comment on the video that's like, oh no, you ruined this one book. Now I know there's an unreliable narrator in that story. And I'm like, okay, homie, but you clicked on the video called
Right.
Unreliable Narrators. Like, I don't know how to help you. But so you get it all the time. Now that I'm thinking about it, the weird thing for me as being like so pro spoiler as I am on SnarkSquad.com, like the recaps, we were so careful about Buffy like spoilers because I had never watched the show. And on Game of Thrones, I spoiled myself, but there, for the most part, all the other shows, we are very careful not to spoil ourselves as we are recapping because we're also talking about like our reactions real time. Yeah. And it just felt like it would be cheating a little bit if I like read ahead and found out what Buffy was doing and then inserted that kind of commentary into the recap. So
yeah, especially because of the way that we were approaching that too. Like we set it up framed as you are the person who's like experiencing this as it's happening, and like because we whatever, and then like Kirsty has seen it a bajillion times, and so like having that like that dynamic was part of how we were setting up the frame of those recaps, and is part of how we set up the frame of the recaps on a number of shows. Like that's like we have somebody who doesn't know anything, and like that's a thing frequently when we're setting up the sort of recap teams. So that is really interesting, and I had not even thought of that as a factor, but yes.
I don't know if it makes a difference, especially because we're like pro spoiler to spoiler ambivalent here. But does it make a difference for you guys when there is like a specific spoiler, like he's dead the whole time, or if it's like a hint of a spoiler, like there's a twist in this book? which I find that a little more annoying because then the entire time I'm like, where's the twist? Like, I would rather know he's dead the whole time than have my brain, like, churning in this very, like, ambivalent way that, like, I should be expecting a twist.
Yeah, I feel like the sort of like wink wink spoilers I actually get more annoyed about because it like builds up this sort of like hype in my brain, kind of like you were saying, where like you're then waiting for this thing and they're like, and when someone's like, you know, just you wait, it's like, wait for what? Like, what do you mean? So I'm just like, you should have just not even said anything. So that's what I tend to warn about in my own videos. Like if I'm doing a review for a backlisted book, for example, that I know is pretty popular and it's a book in a series, I'm like, hey, you know, comment down below and let me know your thoughts, but like don't mention anything about the like later books. Like don't leave a wink face, okay, about something I said, because I don't want to have to read into it. Like those are the kind of spoilers that I actually get more annoyed about. If someone were to like just probably blatantly spoil something, I'd probably be less mad than the ones that are hinting at alluding to something and then I'm trying to figure it out myself. I don't want to do that kind of mental Olympics.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm like, hearing you guys describe this, like, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. I mostly am now just really anxious that I have been doing that to people. Am I giving people these terrible, like, I know that that other people care more about spoilers than I do. Just like inherently, like my like lack of caring. So like if you care even a little, you care more than I do. So I'm like, I try in conversation to be more cautious about it. I don't know, like it makes sense. Like the sort of like wink winky spoiler makes sense though, right? Like I don't know, if you're trying to have a conversation with someone about something that you like a piece of media that you experienced and they haven't yet, and you're trying to communicate something about that, how else do you do that? Right? Like if you don't want to tell your friend he's dead the whole time, then what else do you say? Right? Then what else do you say beyond oh, the twist was wild or whatever?
I totally get why it happens. I just think that it's a little more difficult for my brain to process because it's reaching at like straws at that point. Like, you know, it's a twist and I'm reading this with an eye that I would not have read it otherwise, where if I know something solid, like it's a little bit different for me. But I get like when you're trying to have these conversations. We mentioned this when we were talking about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend in that episode, but I was bothering Nicole so much about whether Greg would stay around and if she ended up with him, and you kept trying to do like the wink wink thing to me, but it kept bothering you. And finally you were just like, he leaves the show and it's besides the point. Like, I was like stunned into silence. So
I don't know. This question of how do you talk about a piece of media without spoiling people? I don't know. Maybe we aren't the best people to be answering that question because there's not enough like concern for spoilers. I think Sam has probably all of the concern for spoilers that is present in this conversation, which is not much. So maybe not like the best people to be answering this question of how you can talk about a thing. I guess for some people, maybe the answer is you just don't talk about it, which is an unacceptable answer.
See, that's sort of my answer. Like, if you're like really concerned about it, or if you have a friend that you know doesn't like spoilers, and it's like you just don't talk about that thing. Besides being just like, I love it, but you just don't say why at that point, and then you just badger them until they like read it or watch it, and then like that's how you spend your time now. Like that's just what you do because yeah, like, you can't. It's not safe. It's not safe territory.
It's not safe.
Have you watched it? No. Okay, bye.
Right, basically.
I guess you don't really value our friendship. So.
These are conversations I've had with people, so no big deal.
So this is a conversation about spoilers and also friendship in an age of media saturation.
So as super like consumers of media and people who are online a lot, do you guys find that you ever or often go into media now not knowing much or anything about that piece of media?
Ooh.
That's a really good question. I think it is probably pretty rare that I go into a piece of media knowing nothing about it. Partially, I think this is going back to baked into the question, being that I consume a lot of media, there is an element of I have to know something to compel me to pick this over any of the countless other things I could be picking at this moment. So there's a little bit of that. I will say it is pretty rare. It's more likely to happen with books for me, I will say, because I'm not a super active part of like the online book community outside of this podcast, but I obviously am friends with, both of you. I know people who make booktube videos and I'm subscribed to them. So I have this habit of I'll like watch a video from one of you. There's like maybe 3 or 4 people whose videos I'm like, okay, you've mentioned a book. This sounds interesting to me. I will put a hold on it at the library and then I will completely forget about it until like suddenly the library emails me to tell me that I have this book. And I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I like 3 months ago, I was really sure I wanted to read it. So I guess I will. So like there's that. The only reason I even thought of that is because I'm currently making my way through the final Daughter of Smoke and Bone book. And that was totally one of those that like I had seen it mentioned enough times on BookTube that I requested it. And truly, like when I started reading it, I was like, I have no idea what this is or why I'm reading it. But cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on BookTube and I do the same thing, honestly. Like, so there's a lot of books that, like, technically I knew stuff about because that's why I added them to my TBR. But TBR being to be read, if you're not like in the know about the BookTube lingo. But there's plenty of books that I've added to my TBR that like I've heard about them at some point and something I liked. But then by the time I get them or get around to them, I'm like, I don't really know why I was interested in this thing, but I was, and I trust myself, so now I'm going to read it. And then usually I'll be reminded when the thing happens, and I'm like, oh right, that's why. But yeah, I frequently will go into books like semi-blind, and people are like, well, why'd you get that book then if you don't know anything about it? I was like, well, because like 4 months ago, someone said it was cool. Like, I don't know.
Sometimes I get super nostalgic for my pre-BookTube days where even maybe like before I was active on the internet and Goodreads and stuff, where I would just wander into a bookstore and grab books because they looked pretty or the back of the book sounded nice. And I consume so much media around books now that I feel like all of my reading is directed by this stuff. Like somebody said this was cool, so I put it in my cart or whatnot, or I've heard reviews about this. So sometimes I get a little nostalgic and I'll just wander in the library and pick things up just based on the description or whatnot. And I won't read any reviews because that's another thing. I'll look it up, and if the reviews are like 3 stars, I'm like, nah. And so, but you might be missing out on something that's like a 5-star review for you. You never know. Most of the time, I don't have time for that, but every once in a while, I'll crave that. Like, I'll just want to jump into a story that I have not heard anybody talk good or bad about. Like, I just want to make up my own mind about it. The area where I'm like most likely to come across something, I have no idea what I'm watching. And if you've listened to this podcast, you know it's movies. Anytime we're watching a movie, I'm like, I don't know why we're watching this or what it is, but I saw this thing, so I have no idea ever what's going on with movies.
It's just me putting something on the spreadsheet.
Yes.
You're like, great.
I'm like, Star Wars. I guess I'll watch that.
Yeah, it's been interesting too. I think there have been a couple things that we have done on the podcast that I knew fairly little about. Like Maniac comes to mind as something that like we knew that it was Emma Stone and Jonah Hill and it was going to be a Netflix show, and like just like timing wise, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that a lot of our decision making about what we're going to talk about is very haphazard and isn't necessarily motivated by
it's organic.
It was just like, well, we have to record something that weekend, and this Netflix show comes out that weekend. I don't know. Maybe we should just talk about that. That was something that I knew fairly little about, in part because the advertising for it was very like deliberately very vague and revealed very little. But I think with visual media, to that point, like about the advertising being very vague, with movies and TV shows, the trailers, like they have trailers that often tend to be very revealing. And so I can't remember the last time that I watched something without seeing a trailer for it first. the vampire movie that Nick made us watch. Near Dark. That is probably the last movie that I watched without watching a trailer for it first.
Okay, so now thinking about this, as pro spoiler as I am, I get really annoyed when the best bits of a movie are in the trailer. And I seen the trailer, I'm like, that looks good. I go to the movie and it's all like filler, and the 4 things I saw in the trailer. And that's when probably a spoiler is like annoying to me, and I get why they do it. Like, you're putting your best foot forward. You got me here, so it worked. But also,
that's just like the movie wasn't that good. Is really what it boils down. And like the trailer editors were like, well, here's all the good material.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time that I like really did anything media related without seeing some kind of trailer or hearing some kind of synopsis. Like, I do not go into things like completely blind. Like I said, I'll forget things, but as far as being completely blind, it just doesn't happen. And that the nostalgia you were talking about for just being able to like wander into a library or a bookstore, like I don't have that nostalgia because those times filled me with anxiety that I was making the wrong decision. So like me having access to reviews, to trailers, like that's good for me, because otherwise I was crippled by it. Like, I would never buy books when I was younger because I'd be like, is this the right choice to spend my $15? Like, I couldn't do it. So me having access to people reviewing things or to like trailers or whatever, like I need that, because otherwise I won't enjoy anything because I won't try it.
Listen, spoilers are a saving grace for, like I mentioned, people like me who have anxiety, people who have any kind of squicks or anything like that. Like, I've talked a lot about how scary is not for me, and like the occult is not for me. And so there are times there are pieces of media that are like kind of on the line, and I can just ask people like, hey, even specifically thanks to the wonderful community that we've built up, around a Snark Squad and on BookTube and stuff, but would I like this? And people will be like, no, girl, stop. Don't do it. Or yeah, you can handle this. So it helps a lot, I think, for people to navigate media and to really, dole out their time. We have limited amount of time in all of the media, and it can be a good tool to use in that way.
Yeah, that's the thing too. Like, there's, you have reviews about media, you have trailers, you have all of these things that are giving you information about the story, and it's giving you information that is meant to motivate you to like buy the movie ticket or like buy that book or whatever. So one of the things that I sort of always come back to, though, is what is the point at which you're overstepping? Like, where's the line on how much information is like too much information to have before you go into your viewing or reading or whatever experience?
I was trying to apply this to my like blocking of all the things about Infinity War, and I'm like, is there something that could be told to me where I'd be like, I'm no longer going to watch it? Probably not. But it's so hard to tell like which, like I feel like for certain genres, I think spoilers do kind of ruin things. Like the thing of like action movies, I think if you get big spoilers for the Marvel movies, they can kind of ruin some things, like because you're no longer as emotionally invested. Like there were certain things, and I go back and forth. As I'm saying this, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know. I was spoiled for a lot of Game of Thrones because I didn't watch it for years and then got all of the spoilers, and I didn't care because I knew like it was fine with me. So I knew about the big one that sticks out is I knew about Oberyn dying in season 4, and I was like, okay, so I'm not going to get attached to him, like I know what's coming, and then I'm like,
can you not get attached?
I know, exactly. Then I'm like, shit, and so like so yeah, like even things like that where it's like character deaths where you're like, okay, well I'm not going to get attached. Like with all the Game of Thrones deaths, really, like of the characters you're supposed to like I definitely still get attached to them, even when I knew that they were going to meet their untimely demise. So. Yeah, I don't really know what the one thing would be that'd be like, okay, now that has officially ruined everything for me.
The Avengers thing is really interesting to me. One, because the spoiler that I mentioned getting, I don't think detracted anything from my experience of the movie, which that's all I'll say. But I am curious so we're recording this now, the weekend, like the next Avengers trailer is already out, like just came out this weekend when we are recording this. And I feel like it was all over Twitter. Like, I'm like, how are you doing this?
I'm not watching it. And I'm sort of like, okay, why is there a helmet? Like, so I am like seeing, I am seeing things. I just kind of like, my brain is choosing to just ignore it. You know, you're going to watch it soon. But like, at this point, I'm kind of like, okay, am I going to get spoiled before Infinity War, before I actually get around to it? Because I don't own a TV right now. And so I'm not like watching any of the Marvel stuff and catching up like I plan to. So yeah, it's rough territory out there right now. But so far, I have managed to avoid it. I think because I like the hashtags for at least Infinity War, and like all of the characters I blocked all of those words. So I'm still seeing just like if someone just posts a video, but I'm not seeing like talk, you know, like tweets that are text tweets about stuff. It's just like, you know, Endgame trailer, and I'm like, what does that mean? So yeah, and plus there's so many characters in those movies now that it's just like, it's overwhelming. So I don't even know what a big spoiler would be at this point. Like who are the characters involved with the big spoiler, because there's 35 of them. So like I don't know. So I think that makes it easier, where like, you know, with the original Avengers, it was like you only had 5 to worry about, and now you have a million. So yeah.
Right.
I think for me, so Nicole, you kind of were touching on how books or media where a spoiler ruins it is maybe not a good piece of media. I will amend and say that it's probably not a story that I would particularly enjoy. Like, I'm a huge rereader and re-consumer of media, and so that means that I lean towards things that have something to offer even after you know every single plot point. So they're things with rich settings or very beautiful language or something familiar that keeps you coming back. So the fact that I know the plot never really detracts from a story for me, as someone who loves to continue to consume stories over and over again. If there have been stories, things that I've read or things that I've watched, where it relies on kind of that one big twist or that moment that changes everything. But then I don't want to read or watch it again. It's not a story for me. So those are the pieces of media that I think you reach a point where it's like a piece of information too much, and like it's over, it's done for you. And maybe I wasn't interested in that in the first place. But for everything else, I'm like, I don't know, just keep telling me stuff about the story. I still get to discover the characters for myself, interpret it myself, see how you reach all of these things, by myself. And I've even had people tell me like things about a story, and then when I go and read it, it's like completely different from what they said, to myself or how I experience the story. And that's the great thing about, everybody enjoying a piece of media for themselves. So the limit does not exist is what I'm saying for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also agree with sort of the general sentiment that this thing of like, is the story actually any good? I would also amend my own statement to say that I think that whether or not it's any good is sort of, I don't know, irrelevant and like not the point. It's not for me is what it is. If a story that has sort of, okay, you know all the information and that's like, then you've ruined the whole experience. That is just not a story that I am likely to get much out of or enjoy. Again, and for me, it's not even just the like being able to go back to it. To me, it is stuff like this. It's conversations like the, like the ones that we have on this podcast. Like that to me is much of what I'm looking for. I want to be able to have this really, intense conversation about how you interpreted, this scene or that writing choice. That to me is as much what I get out of it as any sort of the particulars of this happened and then this happened and then this happened. I don't know. That just to me is, it's like that's not the point for me. I don't know. Maybe it is for other people, but it is definitely not for me. So I also fall into the limit does not exist camp.
I totally get people who want to experience stories for themselves first before they experience a story through somebody else's lens or information. I guess the point for me is that I don't care what order I experience it in.
Same.
I can experience it through your information and then for myself or vice versa, and I'm all cool.
this is like a separate thing that we have also talked about maybe doing an episode on at some point in the future, but and we've sort of alluded to this idea of not reading reviews before we talk about stuff on the podcast, because you don't want like other people's opinions to inform your opinions. And much like my sort of general whatever spoiler feelings, I'm also like, that's totally the opposite of my perspective. I wouldn't say totally the opposite, because it's not like I go into every episode having read a ton of reviews. It's more that I similarly am ambivalent about the order. Like either I can read a bunch of reviews and then I can talk about it, or I'll talk about it and then read some reviews after, whatever. Because I am so driven by the conversations that I'm like cool with the idea that my opinion is going to be changed by other people's opinions. Like that doesn't concern me. I don't hold the idea of my own opinion being formed in a vacuum to any sort of high esteem. Like that to me as an idea isn't something that I care that much about, partially because it's not being formed in a vacuum. Even if I haven't read another review, I've still I digested all of the other ideas about media that I've digested. So I don't really see the difference that a review makes. And like, if my opinion is ultimately going to be like swayed by a review, then I don't really see whether it matters if I share my opinion before it gets swayed or after.
Yes.
I am also really curious, since you guys are both on this episode and you talk about books a lot, how you feel about books that have been adapted and how much it matters to you if you read the book before watching an adaptation.
I think we have opposing opinions just based on me listening to you guys talk about books and what Mari does before with books and movies. I tend to, like, if I'm going to watch an adaptation, I'm kind of more leaning towards like not even reading the book. Like, because, or if I do read the book, I want to read the book way in advance, like when it's first announced it's going to be adapted. I don't want to read it back to back if I can help it. Although sometimes I'll read something and be like, wait, there's a movie about this, and then watch the adaptation, which is always a bad choice for me, because I do sit there, like if I'm reading them back to, like if I'm ingesting them back to back, then I am comparing them, but I don't really want to, because I don't like comparing adaptations. I think we talked about this on the adaptations episode. So I don't like having that to like compare against, because I don't want to be judging it in that way, because I know they're two separate things. So typically speaking, if I am interested in the adaptation version and I found out about that first, then I will just do the adaptation and not go back and watch or read the original, which I know infuriates a lot of people, but I don't care.
I'm fascinated by adaptations, so I typically, if it's a movie that I'm going to watch, which is usually how it happens, book to movie, I will try and hold out to read the book first, just because to me, so I guess going from the more information to the less information makes sense to me in the way that I'm consuming the media, but it's not like a hard and fast rule, and I've definitely done it the other way around. Notably, I saw all of the Harry Potter movies before I read any of the books, so I went from the movies to the books in that instance, and I'm finding that experience can be really rewarding sometimes. So most recently, I was starting to read Emma by Jane Austen, and I could not get into it for the life of me, mostly because Emma is like loud and wrong a lot at the beginning of that story, and she was just annoying me a lot, and so I was kind of like struggling with it. So I went and I watched the adaptation, the BBC one, and then I watched the Gwyneth Paltrow adaptation, and after that I went back to the book and I started from the beginning and I read it all in one shot, and I loved it. So something about seeing the story fully and kind of knowing how it ends and how Emma grows as a character really helped me understand and process the story and go back to it and consume it that way. And it was much more rewarding to consume it after I knew what the end was, to kind of see the little pieces that Austen was like weaving in through the story. So I think it depends on the media, but for the most part, I will hold out and do book to movie. But also, if I'm watching any kind of adaptation, I want the source material, I want the spin-offs, I'm going to wiki it. Like, I want all the information.
Gotta reduce that stress.
Yes, that FOMO. And on that note, that brings us to the end of another episode. Thank you so much to Sam for joining us this week, and thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear all of your thoughts on spoilers, especially if you are very anti-spoiler. We'd love to talk to you about this. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also sign up to join our community on Patreon.com/SnarkSquad. Like we mentioned, this week's topic was chosen by patrons. You can check out our polls and bonus content on Patreon. You can also find us on Twitter at @Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
And I am at Thoughts on Tomes.
Thank you as always to Stefan Chin for our fancy theme music that is playing us out right now. We'll be back in your podcast feed next week. Bye.
Bye.